Hello, my name is Nathan Bailey. I'm a volunteer with the Edwin Washington Project. My video will be on transportation, school transportation of students within Loudoun County Public School System from 1871 through 1968. This is a segregated period in Loudoun County's school system. Okay, but what is the Edwin Washington Project? Okay. Records were found in the Leesburg Training Center that date back to the 1860s. And these records are school records from such things as payroll, tests, etc. And they document the black and white experience in Loudoun County during that time. Now, Loudoun County tasked Larry Rader and the Edwin Washington Project with investigating these records and documenting that period in Loudoun County's history. I'm going to do the transportation part of school education in Loudoun County. But who was Edwin Washington? Edwin Washington was a 16-year-old former slave in 1865. He worked downtown Leesburg in one of the hotels, and he wanted to go to school. He lobbied with his employers to be allowed to go to school, and they said, this is fine, as long as it doesn't interfere with your work. So, Edwin Washington began attending a Quaker school in Leesburg and became our, I had the term, not benefactor, but became our symbol. Now, what assets does the Edwin Washington Project have? Okay, we have those records, we have photographs, we also have a website that includes such things as a transportation section, a section on schools for both blacks and whites, as well as maps. Now, in transportation, my responsibility, maps are very important. You want to get from point A to point B, and one of those points has a schoolhouse on it. Now, in 1923, O.L. Emmerich developed the following map. Okay? As it turns out, he was a trained surveyor, and this map shows the location of black and white schools in the 6 school districts of Loudoun County. It also shows roads that traverse the county at that time. But this is still a static map, okay? 1923 is all it represents. What happened after 1923 cannot be shown on this map. So for that, we have an app in the form of a digital map that can be accessed through the Edwin Washington Project website. This map shows schools, both past and present, their locations, and it will provide the user with the ability to map their directions from where they are to the location of one of these schools or cities. It also has links to other things within the website that give more information on schools. So, let's continue. Transportation, Loudoun County. Now, I'm going to give you a summary of this. This is a high level. If you want more detail, please go to the Edwin Washington Project website, or we have a book, Dirt Don't Burn. You can get more detail there. But in 1871, the school system for Virginia opened. Loudoun was part of that. And students began attending school in terms of a public school system. Transportation in those days was very simple, okay? It's pretty much what everybody did. You hoofed it. Shoe leather, the old one foot in front of the other mode of transportation. In those terms, transportation was pretty much equal. Whites and blacks attended their local schools, never traveling more than a few miles from their home, but they were walking. If you were lucky, you might have the benefit of a horse or a mule, or maybe even a wagon. But remember, Loudoun was an agricultural community. So things like horses and mules were needed on the farm. They couldn't spend their day down at the schoolhouse waiting to come home. So in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court ruling that said separate and equal was constitutional. So this opened the door for Jim Crow. Well, we could have separate schools. We could have separate transportation to those schools. We could also have separate restrooms, separate water fountains, separate pools. In fact, if you wanted to ride on a train or bus, you might have a designated section if you were black. Furthermore, the Jim Crow laws prevented blacks and whites from traveling on the same bus. So if you had a white bus driver, generally they were carrying white buses with white students to a white school. Let's talk a little bit about the buses. In 1911, the first school bus showed up in Loudoun County. And this table summarizes the evolution of school buses from the 1800s to 1950. And in it you'll see they started out as horse-drawn wagons. Okay? Horse-drawn wagons that evolved into that were called school hacks, and evolved into school hack bodies mounted on automotive chassis, and eventually became the big yellow school bus that we know today. So in 1911, the first one of these was recorded in the Jefferson district of Loudoun County. W.G. Edmondson was the superintendent of schools at that time, and he began the process of consolidating small white schools into larger schools. It was more cost effective for a single school in an area rather than a lot of little schools. But as a result of that, they had to have transportation. Okay? And that transportation showed in the form of school hacks, as I said, that began in 1911. This report shows the projected expenditures for 1917 and 1918, 1917 and 1918, 1918 and 1919. And there's a line item in here for pupil transportation. In 1917, it was $1,400, and they expected it to be $1,700 in 1918. In 2425, the first motorized school bus showed up in Loudoun County. Once again, this was just for white students. Okay? And by 1935-36, buses were traveling throughout the county. This Transportation of Pupils report shows a list of drivers, the destination schools, and the city the driver lived in. Now, all of these were white drivers, all of these are white schools, and it's presumed that they were only carrying white students. Furthermore, in 1937, we have evidence that the first black school bus driver by the name of Will Brown made his appearance. Now, this report is a transportation data report from Loudoun County from 1935 through 1939. And what you'll see on here is in 1935, no blacks were riding buses. In 1936/37, 15 students were being bused to the Leesburg Training Center. This was considered, that time, the black high school for blacks in Loudoun County. Okay, this was very likely Will Brown's bus, And as you see on here, elementary schools then began to get bus service after that. But until 1936-37, blacks had no public school transportation. So, considering that in 1911 they started transporting whites by school hack, horse-drawn carriage, and in 1925 they started with motorized school buses, it was another 12 years until blacks had public school transportation in Loudoun County. John C. Walker was president of the Loudoun County Teachers Association and sent a letter to O.L. Emmerich and said, "We need money, I would like money, for a colored school supervisor." This is a letter of Emmerich's response, which he said, "That's not in the budget, but I have $800 for the transportation of blacks." 1937. An excerpt from the NAACP report 1938-39 shows the cost of transporting blacks and whites in Loudoun County. And you'll see here $1,200 for blacks, $22,000 for whites. Not necessarily equal, even though it's separate. In 1939 and 40, Gertrude Alexander, who was a jeans supervisor, wrote two papers. One talked about the fact that blacks had no high school in Loudoun County. In fact, they were having to go as far away as Baltimore. The other paper described the school location conditions. Black schools were generally far away in remote areas, and in some cases required quite a hike to get to. In 1941, Oscar Emmerich stated to the Director of Finance in the Board of Education in Richmond that Loudoun County had no intention of transporting black and white students in the same bus, and they had no intention of them going to the same school. In 1944, James Raby, a lawyer in Loudoun County representing black students, wrote a letter to Emmerich and said, in the vein of Plessy versus Ferguson, you have buses for white students. Black students should also have school buses. By 1954, we've got Brown versus Board of Education. We know how that came out. It overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. But as a result, which pretty much said you're going to integrate your schools, you're going to integrate your public school transportation systems, in Virginia, there was an activity called massive resistance. In one case, the county, as a result of this, people were so against integrating the schools that in Prince Edward County in Virginia, the schools were closed for 5 years. During that time, white students might attend private schools, but black students generally were left to attend whatever education they could get in their local church or halls. Okay? Loudoun County, though, did not pursue closing the schools and instead pursued integration gradual starting in 1962. And by 1968, integration of the schools was well underway. So that's the summary of that period. And now we're going to visit some of these sites and talk about the transportation aspects. So, road trip, I call shotgun.